All right, welcome to Peace of Mind Radio Podcast. I am Brian Ramsey. That's Eric Douglas. So this week is an interesting one, probably near and dear to my heart more than anything else. But it is a result, or the topic is a result of a conversation that you and I've had with a client about a blended family. So what are some of the things that we should be talking about, or you should be considering, or well, there's a laundry list. I mean, literally, we got it down to 4, but there's a whole laundry list of information that you need to be considering if you are involved in a blended family. This is a product of a result of a client that Eric and I share, where we're having to have conversations because it is a blended family.
Unfortunately, they can be uncomfortable conversations, but at the end of the day, they're extremely necessary, especially from an estate planning perspective. These are very, very important conversations that absolutely have to take place, and if they don't, the results could be catastrophic down the line.
Yeah. Well, so the very first one that we brought up.
Let's just start with the most uncomfortable one.
Well,
right?
Listen, hey.
Yeah.
I am involved in a relationship that is going to result in a blended family being put together, and literally within like the first 3 or 4 conversations, we're kind of like, what do you feel about a prenuptial agreement? And she was like, oh, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, thank God. It was sort of it was a very casual conversation, but it's important to have. And the one thing you don't want to do is literally wait until the last minute when you're getting ready to be married and you go, oh, by the way, there has to be a prenuptial agreement.
Well, that's just relationship advice, right? Springing that up at the last second.
Yeah, it's not good. Not good.
Not the best way to start off a marriage.
And we're not going to go into the details of the prenuptial agreement, but essentially what you're saying is, here's how it works in the event that the marriage doesn't work out. Now, it's terrible to even have that conversation because you don't want to go into a marriage going, well, it's probably going to fail. But the reality is that in America today, 50-some% or some odd percent or whatever of marriage fail, and it's higher in a second marriage than the first.
The reason
which I found that's hard to believe.
Well, the reason that number is so high is because when you look at the total number of marriages that end in divorce, it's like 50%.
Yeah.
But it's actually first marriages only end in divorce like 30% of the time. The number is driven so high because second, third, and fourth marriages, every time that number gets a little bit higher, the rate of divorce actually increases.
Yeah.
So you're more likely to have a divorce on your second, third, or fourth marriage than you are on your first.
Yeah. So again, another reason why having that difficult conversation about a prenuptial agreement up front, it makes things a little easier if it doesn't work out. It's no different, so we own a business here, and we're all business owners. We essentially have a prenuptial agreement, right? If we have a partner that exits or leaves or retires or passes away or becomes disabled, there's an agreement in place that says here's what happens if that happens. So, again, you don't ever want to, go into a partnership and say, well, it's going to dissolve, but you have to put things in place in case something does happen. So
you didn't take it quite as personally as my wife would if I had approached her about.
Well, yeah, that's right.
What to do? But.
Yeah, see, I got the prenuptial thing out of the way right up front. I'm like, all right, look, date number 2. All right, what do you think about prenuptial agreement? It's not exactly how it worked, by the way. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting is if there is a disparity of assets going into a second marriage, right? So you've got husband or wife has a lot of assets and the spouse doesn't have a lot of assets coming to the table. So that is, again, a situation where prenuptial agreement is going to be important to have that conversation. I keep looking at the producer, only because he's mostly in the shows. Yeah, and he's now producing, so I keep looking over there. So if you see me and you're like, who is that dude looking at? I'm actually looking at Chris, who's normally in the podcast. So, but a disparity of assets, right? That requires a lot of planning because number one, what happens if if you're bringing in a lot of assets and now you're supporting a spouse with maybe has kids, and so now your assets are now supporting their kids, and you have kids on your own. It could be that if you pass away prematurely, sort of what happens to your assets, because obviously the person with the most assets would be distributed to their children, you would think, but you don't want to not take care of your spouse. So there's all these different issues that come up when there's a disparity of assets in a relationship. So again, that's an issue that that's just an issue that you have to address.
For sure.
So the second one, I'm going to let Eric kind of take this one because this is an interesting one. We actually went there and we're like, so Chris and I were sort of pre-show talking about, well, here's maybe the top 4 things we want to talk about. And one of them was Social Security. Mm-hmm. and so Eric's sort of our resident Social Security expert. Although Chris and I know a lot about it. Eric probably knows more about it than anybody here, probably more than anybody in the city, really. But we were like, I don't know the answer to this one. Let's just go to Eric. So talk about marriage, divorce, second marriages, Social Security benefits, because that's a major issue.
Yeah, for sure. Well, because you were mentioning, when you have, typically it's going to be the husband, but whether it's the husband or the wife, or if there's any type of major disparity between the two incomes, and say, for instance, if you have like a stay-at-home, one of the spouses stays at home and they're not earning an income, which means they're not contributing to their Social Security benefits later on in life. Well, if they have a divorce, there are divorced spousal benefits available to you. Basically, if your marriage lasts longer than 10 years, you are eligible to receive divorced spousal benefits, which is basically 50% of whatever the PIA, which is the primary insurance amount, is. Primary insurance amount is basically the full Social Security benefit at retirement. So
at your full retirement age.
At full retirement age, correct.
Not when you retire, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's based upon whenever, whatever the spouse's full retirement age is. So
right.
I know that was an absolute mouthful that I just said, but basically what that means is if a husband and a wife have a divorce, they've been married for 10 years plus. Let's say they divorce at the age of 50. At the age of 60, the wife is actually able to turn on divorced spousal benefits based upon her previous husband's work record.
Yeah.
So, and she can file at 60. Now, if you file at 60, that's the same as filing for Social Security benefits early. So you're not going to get the full benefit, but it is based off whatever the full retirement benefit is for her previous husband. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah. So let's talk about blended families, because that sort of lays the groundwork for a blended family.
Absolutely.
So husband and wife, married for 10 years, gets divorced. She was, let's just say she, for example, no, we'll spin it. We'll say he was a stay-at-home and she was the working spouse. So now he's now met somebody else and he's going to get remarried. Does that affect his spousal benefit he was eligible for from his previous?
So it's interesting. So I guess first and foremost, I should say, if you're married, you can be married more than once, right? And be eligible for multiple divorced spousal benefits. Now, you can only claim for one benefit at a time, but you can actually pick and choose whichever. So you could have a first marriage that lasted 10 years, a second marriage that lasted 8 years, and a third marriage that lasted 10 years. Well, you can actually be eligible for 2 divorced spousal benefits from the first and the third marriage.
Yeah.
But to your point, if you actually remarry before the age of 60, that actually goes out the window.
Yeah.
And you're not eligible to receive a divorced spousal benefit. Now, if your new marriage, if that ends in divorce or ends for whatever reason, you are actually able to go back and claim a divorced spousal benefit from your previous marriage. But as long as you are married or remarried, especially, if you get married before the age of 60, you are not eligible whatsoever for a divorced spousal benefit. Now, after the age of 60, let's say you divorce at the age of 50, 55, whatever, if you're thinking about getting remarried, it might be in your best interest to wait until after the age of 60, because what you can do at the age of 60 is file for your divorced spousal benefit from your first marriage, begin receiving those benefits, and even if you're still working, you can still actually accrue a better benefit based upon your own personal working history, or you're actually going to be eligible to receive spousal benefits based upon your new spouse.
Yeah.
But if you if you delay taking that benefit for as long as you possibly can, that's going to increase the benefit that you're actually eligible for later on down the line. So you can actually turn on a lower benefit now while another benefit actually accrues to a greater and greater value.
Yeah.
once again, I know I feel like I just said a lot.
You did.
and I know sometimes I can go over your head. This stuff can really get into the weeds when you start talking about Social Security options. So it's certainly important, Mr. Producer Chris over there might want to throw our number on the screen, but definitely call us and give us, we can have a conversation about your specific situation. But generally speaking, you are definitely able to file for divorced spousal benefits if your marriage lasted for at least 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, and that was a mouthful, but the biggest takeaway on Social Security is in a blended family, it can make things rather interesting. And so you just want to make sure that even before you jump into a second marriage or a third or whatever the number is, that you just reach out to us or to someone that is a planner that actually does financial planning, just to say, hey, here's my situation. It would be worth you to invest a little bit of time and money into your particular situation and see how it impacts you. Because Social Security is not something that when you turn it on, you just go, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll just go back and change it. It's just It's sort of you set it and forget it. And
once you turn it on, it's on.
Yeah, and it can make a major difference. So just make sure that you give us a call, come in and see us about that. All right. So the third topic that we'll talk about is the treatment of children. So I'm going to set the stage. So as an example, I'll use my situation as an example. So mine's fairly easy in that I have 2 children, and my significant other, not married, but has 2 children. So that's not that big of a deal if we were to say, here's a pool of money, and we're splitting it equally. You just split it, 25% apiece, and it's no big deal. However, there are situations, the couple that I was talking to last week, where it is a little bit of a challenge because happens to be he has one child that's really old. I shouldn't say really old. He's older. And then she has children that are younger. She has 3, and they're high school age. His other son, he actually has a grandson, which is interesting. So his son has a child, so he's a granddad, and then he's a stepfather to 3 young kids. Mm-hmm. So, which is not that uncommon, really. That's the first time I've seen it. So the question becomes, how do we treat children when we're both gone? And that can be kind of a tricky situation because depending on if it's, again, it goes back to that same scenario. If one spouse has more money than the other, if they come into the marriage with equal assets, how do you split it up? In this case, the couple, it's a little bit of a disparity, but not that big of a deal. I mean, it is somewhat equal assets. And so what we wound up doing was just doing trust planning, which is the proper way to do it, so that assets do get split equally among the families. That's kind of how we set it up to do that. But anyway, so that there is, when it comes to treatment of children, it can be done. The best way to do it is through trust planning, mm-hmm. and you have the trust to make sure that assets get dispersed to children the way you want, how you want, when you want. But really, to do it any other way, just outside of trust planning, is just very, very tough. But you also have to make sure that you understand every asset, what asset came to the marriage from that particular spouse, what assets they've accumulated together as a family, and then how each of those assets are distributed to the kids. That's the biggest thing, right, Mr. Producer, is you want to make sure that we understand what came into the marriage with that particular husband or wife, and then what have they accumulated together, and then how each of those assets, I'm doing exactly what you said. I'm banging the mic with my shoulder. But anyway, he told me not to do that, and I'm doing it anyway. But it is important to understand premarital asset, marital assets, and how they're distributed to kids.
Well, whenever you're blending families, if you pass away, that's just more hands in the pot. Yeah. That are going to try to claim or lay claim to some type of an asset that you're leaving behind. And if you're not taking the proper precautions or putting those precautions in place, primarily through trust planning, then it's hard to dictate from the grave who's going to get their hands on your money after you're gone. Yeah. So that's why you want to be able to control from the grave exactly how your assets are passed from yourself to the next generation.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to
throw something in real quick. You can answer. What if somebody inherits, the blended family inherits from one side?
So, Mr. Producer, you probably didn't hear that. Mr. Producer is asking a question that's not on our list, our 4 topics, but I'll go ahead and answer it. He's basically saying, what happens if let's say husband and wife are in a blended family. They have blended assets, and let's say the female, the wife, inherits money. That's what how does that work? Again, it goes back to that same conversation. What assets are premarital assets? What are postmarital assets, meaning joint assets? And it all comes down to trust planning, because trust planning is the only way those assets are going to be distributed to the right side of the family. So in this case where you have your spouse, so if the wife inherits money, that money should stay within her bloodline. The only way to keep it in her bloodline is to make sure that's in trust planning and it gets allocated to her children and not go over to his children.
But the
that's
trust,
the only way to do it.
but the trust planning would need to be done by the person who passed away, because if the trust planning was not done at that level before she received that inheritance, then you can make a claim. Or
Well, that's true.
The husband can make a claim that's a marital.
That's very true. That is very true. But you can also there's ways around it. But,
Yeah.
but that's very true. That's ideal. That's what we tell everybody.
Yeah.
Just do your trust planning now, and then you don't have to worry about it. All right. So speaking of trust planning, this is sort of the last one. We get this. This comes up quite a bit. So most of the time, not every single time, but most of the time, when we see blended families, there is a disparity of asset, disparity of wealth. Mm-hmm. So you have one spouse that's has more assets than the other. So what happens is you get in a situation where through a prenuptial agreement, if the one spouse has the majority of the assets, it sort of stays within that particular family. But what you don't want to do is put your new spouse or your second spouse in this case. You don't necessarily want to put them to where something happens to you unexpectedly and then they're sort of out on the street. You don't want to do that. And so through proper trust planning, you can do different things. And I'm going to use me as an example, okay? So I've had conversations with Kelly where what I've said was, here's how this structure would work. Here's a typical planning strategy where, let's say you take the value of a home, which is typically what you do, and you say, okay, if we put this family together and we are in this home together and something were to happen to me, then the home would be paid off, and she has rights to that property throughout her lifetime. And then when she passes away, that asset goes back over to my kids, right? So there's a way you can sort of say, here's life insurance money, here's a property where you put it into a trust, let your surviving spouse benefit from that. And it can be money inside of a life insurance policy too, to say, I'm going to have this life insurance policy, I'm going to set it up to where you get to enjoy the benefit of that money. And then when you're gone or when you pass away, maybe some portion of the life insurance goes to your kids, but the rest of it comes back over to my kids. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of different ways to do it. That's just a strategy that we typically see, especially dealing with a home, is we're going to have that home inside of a trust. She could live there for free the rest of her life. Kids can't kick her out. But then when she's gone, that asset then rolls back over to my kids. That's just an example. There's many, many ways you can do it, right? There's all kinds of different ways to do things. That just happens to be a strategy that we typically see when it comes to blended families. But there's probably 50 different topics we could talk about with blended families.
Well, every situation's so different. Like in that case, you're talking about a lifetime tenant, which is super romantic, right? But
right.
but every family's going to have their own individual dynamics, different kids, different. There's just so many different. Just in the amount of time I've been in the business, I've seen so many different weird family dynamics. Yeah. Not necessarily bad, but just every family dynamic is different. So you want to make sure that you cater or do trust planning that caters to your individual situation.
Yeah. Yeah, so real quick, Mr. Brewster, we have 2 minutes. Maybe. Okay, so here's another one that came up. You and I are working on this case together. Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting one. Not husband and wife yet.
Yep.
Two significant others, been in a relationship for a really, really long time, essentially married, but not technically on paper. So we're doing a plan for them, and we said, well, there's lots of things involved in a financial plan where husband and wife, married husband and wife, have certain benefits, right? Mm-hmm. Well, there's lots of benefits that a husband and wife have, but we're talking about financially speaking. Not that. Now I see what you're all. No, not that. Well, yes, that. But we're talking about.
We're going to have to check the box that says not suitable for children.
Yeah.
On this one.
No, this one happens to be with what I was going with is like power of attorney.
Yep.
As a married couple, you don't have to have power of attorney over your spouse. Just because you're married, you'd have that marital. They don't have that. Mm-hmm. So we had to specifically tell them you have to have documents in place that you can act on the judge's behalf. Mm-hmm. There are, if he were to pass away at this point and give her money, she pays state estate tax, right? Because she's not a spouse and she's not. And so they didn't know that. Yeah. When we brought that up, they're like, what are you talking about? We're like, yeah, that's how this works. You're not married. And so anyway, when you're cohabitating and you're living your life as a married couple, but you're not legally married, there are different strategies you have to put in place in order for assets to flow back and forth as though you were married, even though you're not. Especially powers of attorneys in the document. You got to have healthcare and financial powers of attorney so that you can act on your significant other's behalf, because as a married couple, you don't need it, but as well, in some cases you do. But as a non-married couple, you have to have it. So that's an interesting case. I love working on that one because there's lots of dynamics there that are really, really super interesting. So, but anyway, those are the kind of the four. Again, there's a number of topics. We could keep going on and on about blended families, and maybe we'll do some more and just hit on a couple other topics about blended families. But it's a very interesting situation. Every blended family is a little bit different, as Eric was saying. But there are some very common themes, strategy for handling your finances that are pretty common within blended families. But they just have their own little nuance based on your family dynamic. So again, we're pretty used to it. We've done lots and lots of them. So if you got questions, or you're in a blended family, or better yet, if you're getting ready to get into a blended family, give us a call. We can walk you through what you need to be thinking about. We can also walk you and your spouse through a prenuptial agreement. I've done that on several occasions where they're like, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, I can do it for you. And they're like, okay. It's kind of like mediation. You put them, no, it's not like that. But it kind of is that way. It can feel like that.
Devolves into a psychiatric evaluation as well.
Yeah,
too,
for
right?
Sure. So anyway, that's it for this week. Make sure you tune in next week. We'll have another edition of Peace of Mind Radio podcast. And maybe it's another episode around blended families. Who knows? Just so you know, we have a couple other podcasts. We have Connecting the Commonwealth podcast. We have Burgers and Bourbon podcast. Pretty cool podcast. So just make sure that you check those out, and then I'll let Eric sign us off for the week.
Yep. So make sure you, if you're giving us a listen, we appreciate it. Make sure you click that red subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on your favorite, podcast, station, please make sure you subscribe. Give us a rating and review if you're listening on Apple. We really appreciate it. That's how the show can grow from here. Thanks for watching.
Have a good week.
The information given herein is taken from sources at IFP Advisors, LLC, doing business as Independent Financial Partners, IFP, IFP Securities, doing business as IFP, and its advisors believed to be reliable, but it is not guaranteed by us as to accuracy or completeness. This is for informational purposes only, and in no event should be construed as an offer to sell or solicitation of an offer to buy any securities or products. Please consult your tax and/or legal advisor before implementing any tax and/or legal related strategies mentioned in this publication, as IFP does not provide tax and/or legal advice. Opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not take into account the particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of individual investors. This report may not be reproduced, distributed, or published by any person for any purpose without IFP's express prior written consent. Securities offered through IFP Securities, LLC, doing business as Independent Financial Partners, IFP, member of FINRA and SIPC. Investment advice offered through IFP Advisors, doing business as IFP, a registered investment advisor. IFP and Family Wealth Planning Partners are not affiliated. The information given herein is taken from sources at IFP Advisors, LLC, doing business as IFP, IFP Securities, LLC, doing business as IFP, and its advisors believed to be reliable, but it is not guaranteed by us as to accuracy or completeness. This is for informational purposes only, and in no event should be construed as an offer to sell or solicitation of an offer to buy any securities or products. Please consult your tax and or legal advisor before implementing any tax and or legal related strategies mentioned in this publication, as IFP does not provide tax and or legal advice. Opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not take into account the particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of individual investors.